welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here because today we are going on an absolute journey. We're going to completely demystify oceanography by traveling from the bright, sunlit surface of the water all the way down to the crushing, pitch-black seafloor. We're going to explore exactly how scientists measure and truly understand this vast, watery world that covers, most of our planet. So get ready, because this is going to be a fascinating descent.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our dive plan for today's explainer. We're structuring our descent into 4 stages. First, the surface and chemistry, then down through the water column, followed by mapping the unseen depths, and finally, exploring the ocean floor.
So, stage 1, the surface and chemistry. Basically, the ocean's chemical recipe.
Now, when we talk about ocean chemistry, we've got to start with salinity. Salinity is simply the measure of the amount of dissolved salts, or solids, in seawater. You know how water dissolves stuff, right? We see this all the time when we stir a spoonful of sugar into a glass of tea and it just disappears. But what we rarely see is rainwater percolating through the soil, dissolving weathered rocks and minerals. After passing through that dirt, the rainwater carries those invisible, dissolved minerals straight into our rivers, and those rivers dump them right into the ocean.
And when we actually break down what makes up all that saltiness, it turns out a total of just 6 major ions are responsible for about 99% of the dissolved salts in the entire ocean. It's heavily dominated by chloride and sodium, which, if you put them together, just make plain old table salt. Knowing this exact salinity helps scientists figure out exactly where different marine organisms can actually survive. And here's a pretty wild fact. Ocean water has a salinity of about 3%, which is actually super similar to the salinity of our own human body fluids.
To figure out this complex chemical makeup, oceanographers use a few incredibly clever tools. They use conductivity testing, where they literally pass an electrical current right through the water. Basically, the more salt ions there are, the easier that current flows. They also use a refractometer. This measures how light bends when it passes through the water, because that angle actually changes based on the salinity. And for gases like oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, which are absolutely crucial for marine plant and animal life, they use a titration apparatus with pipettes and chemical indicators. This whole chemical testing thing is just mind-blowing when you realize that if you scoop up just a single handful of ocean water, you are holding almost all of the naturally occurring chemical elements that exist on Earth.
The ocean isn't just some static chemical soup. It is constantly in motion. To study the powerful currents that carry marine life all across the globe, oceanographers sometimes rely on wonderfully simple tools. I'm talking about drift bottles. It is literally a message in a bottle containing a little card asking whoever finds it to report the date, the time, and the exact location of where it washed up. It's a classic, surprisingly effective way to map the speed and direction of ocean waters.
All right, moving deeper into Section 2, the water column, let's look at the physical properties of the water itself.
As we start to sink a little deeper, I want you to think about this. When you watch a nature documentary and you see a massive 150-ton blue whale gliding gracefully through the water, why doesn't it just sink straight to the bottom like a giant stone?
Well, the answer lies in density. In science, density is the mass, or the amount of matter, of an object per unit volume. Try waving your hand through the air, and then imagine waving it through water. The water takes way more effort, right? That's because water is actually 800 times more dense than air. Throw in all that dissolved salt we just talked about, and seawater becomes incredibly dense. So, the crucial rule here is that less dense substances will remain above more dense substances. This is exactly why a massive oil slick from a freighter spill floats like a poisonous blanket on the surface rather than sinking. The oil is actually less dense than the salty ocean water.
And this brings us right back to our whale. Think about a massive land animal, like an elephant or a rhino. They have to constantly battle gravity, using tremendous amounts of energy just to support thousands of pounds of their own weight across the ground. But giant marine animals, like our blue whale, are physically supported by the high mass of those salts and the extreme density of the ocean water around them. It's what allows them to glide so effortlessly.
To measure this physical property of density, oceanographers use an instrument called a hydrometer. Basically, it's a weighted glass tube designed to float upright in the water. Because dense water provides a lot more support, the hydrometer will float much higher up in heavy, salty seawater, and it'll sink way lower in lighter, less dense fresh water.
Now, it's not just salt that affects density. Temperature plays a massive role too. When water is cooled down, its molecules move closer together, meaning there are more molecules per cubic centimeter. This makes cold water heavier and much more dense,
causing it to actually sink below lighter, warm water. To track this, oceanographers lower what's called a Nansen bottle to various depths to collect water and record its temperature. And studying these frigid deep water temperatures has revealed some absolutely amazing adaptations. Like, did you know that some marine organisms have actually developed a biological antifreeze in their blood just to keep from freezing to death? Nature is incredible.
Another absolutely crucial physical feature of the water column is clarity. Marine plants need light to produce food through photosynthesis. So, to figure out exactly how deep that life-giving light can penetrate, scientists use a Secchi disk. They simply lower this round plate, which has a black and white triangle pattern on it, down on a rope until the pattern completely vanishes from sight. By measuring the length of the rope, they know exactly where plant life can and cannot survive.
Which brings us to our third stage, mapping the unseen depths. We're talking about seeing in the dark.
Historically, mapping the dips and mountains of the ocean bottom was, honestly, incredibly primitive. Scientists literally tied a weight to a rope and dropped it over the side. A shockingly slow and frankly imprecise method. But by the 1920s, sonar was invented. Much like dolphins using echolocation, ships could send sound waves down to the bottom and just measure how long the echo took to return. This technology was rapidly refined during World War II by submarines that needed to navigate blindly. And today, we have entered the modern era of incredibly accurate satellite mapping. Now, when ships are mapping locally, they use specialized echo sounding. Seismic profiling uses powerful sound waves, often produced by literal explosions, that punch right through the seafloor and bounce off buried rocks, giving researchers a deep geological profile. On the other hand, side-scan sonar sends sound waves out to the sides of a towed instrument. This paints a wide, highly detailed picture that is absolutely perfect for locating things like shipwrecks or large schools of fish.
But modern satellites? They achieve this global mapping without even touching the seafloor. Instead of bouncing signals off the bottom, satellites actually bounce signals off the ocean's surface. Because water actually piles up slightly over undersea mountains and dips over deep trenches, the satellite can measure these tiny, tiny variations in the surface level. These surface measurements are then fed into a computer, which instantly calculates and produces a super detailed topographic map of the hidden mountains and valleys way below. I mean, measuring the surface to map the bottom, it is absolute ingenuity.
And now, Stage 4. Exploring the ocean floor. Welcome to the benthic zone. We have finally hit the bottom. Because there is absolutely no sunlight down here, at the bottom of our dive, no plants can grow. This means the benthic organisms that live down here are entirely dependent on organic materials slowly settling down from the surface way above them. To study this dark environment and its history, oceanographers have to rely on heavy mechanical devices. A grab sampler acts like a giant set of teeth, literally biting a chunk of sediment right out of the floor. A dredge is a massive scoop that gets dragged along the bottom to collect heavy rock samples. And my personal favorite, the corer, operates exactly like a giant apple corer. It drills down to collect long tube-shaped layers of sediment. These core samples are basically a time machine, allowing scientists to study the changes in marine populations over thousands of years. Of course, they also need to sample the actual life forms down there. For this, they use a variety of specialized nets. They tow cone-shaped plankton nets to catch microscopic organisms. They use stationary, straight seine nets to capture schooling fish at specific depths. And to study the deep-dwelling benthic organisms right on the seafloor, they use heavy trawls. These are large nets aggressively dragged right along the bottom to scoop up whatever is living in the mud and the rocks. Now, you might be wondering, why rely on all these heavy metal instruments and nets? Why not just put on a suit, swim down and look? Well, 36 meters, or roughly 118 feet, represents our limit. That is the maximum depth that human divers using standard scuba tanks can withstand. Beyond 36 meters, the crushing water pressure of the ocean becomes so immense that it physically harms the human body, requiring extremely specialized and, honestly, super cumbersome pressure suits. Which brings us to the end of our dive, leaving us with a truly mind-boggling reality. If human divers are largely restricted to just the top 36 meters, and we have to rely on surface satellites and metal claws to understand the rest, it makes you wonder, if we can map the ocean's topography from space, what other bizarre, ancient, or unbelievable mysteries remain completely hidden from human eyes in those crushing, unexplored depths of the seafloor? Thank you so much for exploring with me today. Keep asking questions, and I really hope this explainer leaves you eager to uncover more of the deep on your own.